have Brooks Marmon presenting his work today, and his work is The Rise and Demise of Zimbabwe Times. Brooks is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies at the University of Pretoria. His research focuses on Pan-African diplomacy and transnational political networks in Southern Africa, particularly colonial Zimbabwe. So we're very excited to hear this work. Just to give you a brief oversight, Brooks will be presenting his work for about 20 minutes, and then we will do a Q&A session back and forth, and we'll do questions after that. So I hand over to Brooks. Very excited to hear your work.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, and looking forward to everyone's feedback on this paper in progress. Bear with me. I want to share my screen. I have a slideshow. Okay, if this is not working, let me know. Yes, so I think maybe start with a disclaimer, especially something to keep in mind during the Q&A. Please indulge me. This is my first time trying my hand at a piece of historical scholarship that looks at colonial Zimbabwe after 1963. So I'm going to be speaking about the late 1970s, and that's a time when the political situation had changed quite significantly. And I'll be speaking on the Zimbabwe Times, a fairly obscure newspaper. I don't know how many of you all will have heard of it. But despite its obscurity, I think the paper can make three core contributions. One, most broadly, that would be our understanding of the media and press landscape in late colonial Zimbabwe. Secondly, and perhaps this may be the crux of the paper, I think it helps to elucidate some of the dynamics of Rhodesia's internal settlement. For those of you who may not know, the internal settlement was an agreement in March 1978 that saw the white government, led by the Rhodesian Front and Prime Minister Ian Smith, bring in three Black political parties that were willing to accept a disproportionate degree of ongoing white control. And thirdly, and finally, I think the paper's existence also sheds some light on the Patriotic Front. And that was an ostensible coalition, sort of a coalition of convenience between ZANU and ZAPU, the two main nationalist parties who did not participate in that internal settlement. So I think I've got 8 more slides. The next 3 are sort of contextual, and then from there I'll really get into the meat of the paper. So for a version of the paper had gone through peer review, and one of the core areas of feedback that emerged was lack of clarity over the reach and sort of the importance of the paper. So I'll try to address that right up front. That is somewhat hard to assess. The paper only existed for about a year and a half until it was banned, April 77 to October 78. Even the circulation figures, I've seen 2 figures cited. One from the Zimbabwe Times itself, about a year into its existence, a figure of 40,000. And then when it was banned, the Herald, the Rhodesian paper of record, cited a figure half that. I don't really know which one I would say is more accurate, but I think even the lesser figure for the market at the time was pretty substantial. And what I would point to in terms of trying to show that the paper wasn't simply an afterthought at the time was its growth. So it started in April 77 as a weekly paper. In December, it became a daily, or well, it was published 6 times a week. I don't think there was a Sunday issue. And then I think in February 78, the size of the issues increased from 8 to 12 pages. And also in terms of its physical presence, originally it had just headquarters in Salisbury, the capital. But by the time it was banned, there were also satellite offices in Bulawayo, Gweru, and Mashingo. And there was also a separate edition produced for the Bulawayo market. So hopefully that gives an indication that despite its short-lived nature, it was a fairly robust publication, and I think there were about 70 staff members when it was banned. So just to orient you all a little bit on the media environment in Rhodesia at the time, and perhaps elucidate why it experienced success in the market. The best known newspaper that catered towards a Black readership in Rhodesia and colonial Zimbabwe was the African Daily News. That's something that scholars have used fairly widely. I relied on it considerably for my doctoral thesis, but it was banned in August 1964. The same time that ZANU and ZAPU were also banned. Its issues were to some degree filled by Moto, which you can see on the slide. Now that was weekly, so the extent of its coverage wasn't nearly as robust. And it also in 1974 was banned due to, I think, its positive coverage about the looming independence of Mozambique. So the Times' main contemporaneous, excuse me, competition, I guess I should use that term fairly lightly, is the title you'll see on the left, the National Observer, which also catered towards a Black audience, but its editors were white, its ownership was white, and I've just the image here. You can see the language that's being used to refer to the guerrilla fighters, the freedom fighters, as terrorists. So it certainly wasn't sympathetic to the nationalist cause. Okay, so the two key figures behind the establishment of the Zimbabwe Times. On the left here, you see Tiny Rowland. That's the chief executive of Lonrho. That's a portmanteau for London Rhodesia, which was a multinational conglomerate, had strong financial interest in Southern and in East Africa. I would say particularly in mining and agriculture, but had some media holdings as well. Tiny Rowland was the chief executive, and he was close to Herbert Munangatere, who became the chief editor of the Zimbabwe Times. Munangatere had been involved in nationalist politics very early on in the 1950s. He was an executive with the City Youth League, but thereafter he sort of withdrew from overt political participation. He seems to have been trying to cultivate the image of a more impartial journalist. He was a prominent journalist on the staff of the African Daily News. I haven't been able to get a whole lot of his background. I know at some point in the 1960s, he left Rhodesia. He first received higher education in the US, I think at Indiana. And immediately before returning to start the paper, he was working directly for Lonrho. So I believe these two figures were fairly close. And I should mention that they're both politically associated with ZAPU and Joshua Nkomo. And so this brings me to what was hinted at or indicated in the title of the presentation, and that is the question of its pro-nationalist slant. So if anyone here is familiar with the literature, please let me know. but to my knowledge, this hasn't been discussed very much, which I find somewhat surprising. So when the paper was banned, there was certainly accusations that the paper had been a front for ZAPU, for Nkomo, but Munangatele strictly denied this. However, I talked to two prominent members of the editorial team who both confirmed this. And interestingly, they stressed that the paper was not just intended to sort of advance ZAPU, but the Patriotic Front as well. However, they noted it was difficult to liaise with the officials from ZANU's publicity team in Maputo at the time. But there was substantial coverage of ZANU's internal wing in Rhodesia, the People's Movement. Just sort of my anecdotal impression from reviewing the paper, probably not quite as much as ZAPU, but I think that can certainly be justified. ZAPU had more high-level officials inside Rhodesia at the time, people like Josiah Chinamano, and certainly in the editorials referred to the Patriotic Front, indicating support for both. But I would also say anecdotally, from my review of the paper, the bulk of the political coverage is probably actually not on the Patriotic Front, but rather the three Black political parties to the internal settlement. But that said, there are certainly very strong signs of ZAPU's engagement with the paper, and perhaps reasons for the ZANU officials to be skeptical. So the party's publicity secretary, Willie Musurura, he penned an anonymous column. And I mean, this guy was incredibly prolific. I mean, I think almost literally every single issue, there's something attributed to Sanga Shanga, Musurura's pen name. If anybody can tell me if there's any significance to that name, I would be most interested. John Lovu, the chief sub-editor who ran the paper's Bulawayo office, who I spoke to, he was personally a strong ZAPU partisan. A few years after the paper's ban, he came to marry Joshua Nkomo's daughter. He told me that when he was recruited to the paper by Munangatele, it was also in the presence of George Kahari, who was ZAPU's deputy publicity secretary. And then the party's education secretary, Sifa Simsipa, had a column. I think it's called I Write What I Like. And that was not anonymous. That was in his own name. So there was this strong ZAPU factor at the paper. But I would like to stress, certainly unlike explicit ZAPU party publications, there's no indication of overt bias. But nonetheless, this connections to the Patriotic Front, and they were certainly, paper was very different in tone from most of what was being published in Rhodesia at the time, created some problems for the Times. And there's, indications even from a year before the ban that it was existing on borrowed time. So the first case that I can find of serious issues was regarding coverage of the arrest and deportation of an American nun, Janice McLaughlin. And so around October 77, apparently Munangatele was informed by members of the Rhodesian Special Branch that he would face legal action for his coverage. Apparently that did not come about, but at the time the paper was banned. And it's interesting that this didn't ultimately play out through the courts. There was a pending case charging that the editors had not followed guidelines in place for reporting on the guerrilla war. There were strict military censorship guidelines in place for that. But interestingly, most of the problems, or the sort of what culminated in the ban, does not seem to have come from the Rhodesian Front or white officials, but rather it was tied more towards the strong antipathy between Abel Muzorewa and the United African National Council. And that was the foremost Black party to the internal settlement, and Nkomo and ZAPU. So for those who may know that the ANC, the UANC predecessor, originally was this sort of umbrella unity grouping that also included ZAPU under the authority of Muzorewa. Didn't last very long. I think around September, October 1975, Muzorewa expelled Nkomo from the ANC. I don't think there's been a whole lot of scholarship on the reasons for their particularly poor relations, which is interesting because those were sort of the two main groups that the Rhodesians, the Rhodesian Front, were trying to negotiate with for a settlement, but very deep-seated antipathy. And so when the paper was banned, the Rhodesian Front, the white co-minister of justice, explicitly blamed it on Muzorewa and the ANC. The internal settlement provided for the country to be governed by an executive council that had rotating leadership. At the time of the ban, Muzorewa and the ANC held the chief position in that council, so the ban order was signed by Muzorewa. And of the various parties to the agreement, the only one that I can find that seems to have issued any sort of statement about the ban was the UANC publicity secretary. And I'll read that out. So he said, quote, "I don't shed any tears to hear of this. They were obviously abusing having a paper in a free nation and taking advantage to publish scandalous things about us." End quote. So something that's also interesting, and I think perhaps may explain why the paper hasn't garnered much subsequent attention, is that unlike the African Daily News, which when it was banned in '64 generated widespread protests, there wasn't a whole lot of response to the banning of the Zimbabwe Times. So the UK National Union of Journalists issued a statement. It was covered in local press and press in the region, was a front page story, but not a huge story. And so, for example, I have this letter to the editor of the Herald, the main Rhodesian newspaper for white audience. That's really the only one that I could find. And also I've got an extract from the Herald's editorial, which condemned the banning, but not using as strong a language as one might expect. And you can see the very last sentence saying, quote, "The government has once again provided its external critics with ammunition," end quote. Well, it's very interesting. The external critics don't seem to have made a whole lot of this. I think when the Times was banned, both Ian Smith, the Rhodesian Prime Minister, and Dabaningi Sithole, one of the signatories to the internal settlement, were both in the US. Muzorewa left Rhodesia for the US shortly thereafter, and I can't find any indication that the ban was talked about a lot. So one of the Zimbabwe Times editors that I spoke to, Tendai Dombachena, he speculated that this was due to the dynamic nature of sort of the UDI crisis at this time, which was approaching its end stages, And that's really the most convincing explanation that I can posit for this as well. So yeah, my final slide here. So Muningatere and Roland, they initially attempted to work around this ban. The staff were kept on paid leave for a number of weeks. Muningatere flew to London to consult with officials at Lonrho, presumably Roland himself. And it was announced that there would be sort of a successor publication of sorts, The World, but that in turn was banned before it could even be published. And one of the few signs that I could find that perhaps this ban had stayed in the public consciousness, and the paper did continue to resonate with people. Once the Lancaster House Agreement was reached, and the British appointed a colonial governor to come out and preside over the independence election, one of that governor's first proclamations rescinded the ban on the Zimbabwe Times. So yeah, that's essentially it. I mean, one thing I think it's very interesting to reflect on would be, I mean, what if the paper had not been banned? What if sort of ZAPU still had this media outlet working on its behalf? How might that have shaped the 1980 election? Then, of course, the following year, with a grant from Nigeria, the government buys out the stable of titles that have been traditionally been geared towards a wide audience, and those become government-controlled entities. So that's something very interesting to think about. And yeah, I mean, the paper, it's fairly brief. I think not quite 7,000 words. It's not really a deep dive into the history of the Zimbabwe Times. I don't think its archive survives. So I don't think there are the sources to do that. But hopefully, in terms of some of these novel insights on the internal settlement, on the dynamics of the PF, it makes an interesting contribution. And I think also it would be great. The paper, I don't think it's very well preserved, although the copies I consulted were microfilmed. But if other scholars could start to use this as a primary resource, I think that would also be a great contribution. So I will wrap up there. Hopefully I haven't gone too much over time, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much for that. You were right on time, so good job. So I open the floor to questions. You're more than welcome to ask them. You can raise your hand, drop them in the chat, or just unmute. Ariana, go.
Hi, thanks very much for the paper. I guess you say in the long version of the paper that you haven't been able to find out the reasons for Lonrho's support of the financing of the paper, but I suppose that's a big question in my mind. It was a big question throughout the presentation, and if maybe you can, if you can tell us a bit more about the company and yeah, anything that might help us understand its financing of the paper. And then I was wondering, in terms of the paper's banning, if it's just a question out of, you know, lack of knowledge, but whether this was totally related to events in Zimbabwe, or if it had any connection at all with a kind of parallel close censorship of Black newspapers in South Africa around this time. Thanks.
Do we have any other questions? Nicole, go.
Hey. Okay, I don't know if yeah, I guess I should be on camera. That was a great paper, Brooks, thanks. I had the same question as Ariana. What were the interests of Tiny Roland in terms of pushing this paper? And I was wondering, particularly in the context of Lonrho being a kind of sanctions busting organization in South Africa, not particularly aligned to the nationalist cause. And then, you know, there are also some allegations that Tiny Roland himself was a British spy, which I think some of the people in the chat would also be aware of. And so I'm kind of curious about to what degree this was also a bit of a front for British interests, right, in the context of the negotiations and what would ultimately be Lancaster House Agreement. Thanks.
Brooks, I think you can answer that and we'll do the next round of questions afterwards there. You've got a good few questions there.
Yes, I do. So yeah, I guess I'll take Ariana's first question, which sort of overlaps with what Nicole had to say, and then injecting the allegations of Tiny being a British agent. So this is where I'll again give my disclaimer about this being a new sort of chronological frontier to my historical scholarship. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of speculation. I mean, the ZAPU archive, as I understand, in the early 80s was confiscated by the Zimbabwean government. So any sort of insights on ZAPU's internal deliberations and discussions with Lonrho, with Tiny are unavailable. Lonrho archive, I don't know the status of that. I imagine they were notoriously secretive, and I think the major biography of Tiny, which actually I was not able to access through interlibrary loan, so I think some of it's digitized through Google Books, but I haven't been able to read it in depth. I think Tiny certainly did not cooperate with that. So that leaves speculation on what Lonrho and Tiny Roland were trying to do. So, I mean, the company did have interests in other newspapers in the region, several ones in Zambia. I don't have full grasp of that in my head at the moment, but I believe they were nationalized by Kaunda. I think there were others as well, maybe in Kenya, Tanzania, and I think one of the main UK newspapers, Lonrho and Tiny, they also got a controlling stake in that, although maybe that was after the period of Zimbabwe Times. So I mean, there certainly seems to be an interest in media. More specifically, I mean, something that I didn't mention here, hopefully I think it's in the paper, but I don't really play it up, is the change situation in the region after the coup in Portugal in April 1974. So I think the first mention I could find to Tiny Roland being interested in starting a paper was 76. So I mean, and this is just inference, would very much see the push to establish a newspaper as trying to take advantage of the detente atmosphere. So most of the major nationalists that had been imprisoned or restricted since ZANU and ZAPU were banned in 64. They were released in late 74. Even the competitor newspaper I mentioned, the National Observer, I've not been able to figure out when exactly that started up, but I think also 76, 77. So there was this somewhat relaxed environment. I think it was early 1977, the Rhodesian Front passed some major legislation that significantly relaxed laws that upheld racial discrimination and segregation. So I would read it in that frame, that there was this new space, and Tiny was trying to take advantage of it. And I think certainly if the paper had not been banned, it would have been in a strong position in independent Zimbabwe, and I think it would have done pretty well commercially. So then, yeah, Ariana's second question, why it was banned. I don't know the SA scene well enough to know what else was going on at that time. That's interesting if there was also quite a bit of action taking simultaneously, but my inclination would be that it wasn't really influenced by external factors. So, I mean, the paper, I mean, from the beginning, from March 78, was opposed to the eternal settlement, thought any sort of agreement that did not include the Patriotic Front was not viable, but it certainly seems to have taken an increasingly confrontational turn against Muzorewa, against the UNC, calling the party totalitarian. So I think it was more a reflection of this feud between ZAPU and Muzorewa.
We have two comments in the chat. Nicole says, also look up Henny Van Vieren's Apartheid, Guns and Money. And then we have Peter Lim saying, Ian Linden does suggest that there may have been some Tory involvement in ZT. Do we have any more questions or comments? Kasondo, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, my camera is not working. Very interesting paper, Brooks. And I don't know if these are questions or really just comments. Similar to Ariana, I find it's very interesting, Tiny Rowland's involvement in the media. I mean, just this morning I saw a reference to Lonrho owning the Zambian TV station just before independence, the state TV station, and then that was nationalized by Cohen, as you said. So I wonder if there would be other references to the Zimbabwe Times in Zambian archives, because ZAPU was very much in Zambia at the time. Maybe not the National Archives of Zambia. Perhaps the Livingstone Museum has a newspaper archive that could be interesting. And then related to that, I don't know if you found any evidence. I know that the actual archives were destroyed, and this is not what your paper is trying to do, but if you found any evidence of a readership beyond Rhodesia, because the previous papers in that sort of market, like the African Daily News, was actually the Central African Daily News, right? It was distributed across the former federation. And yeah, I'm also wondering whether the closing of the newspaper, the banning of the newspaper, might have been in some way connected to, the broader offensive by our Rhodesian front. I mean, just a couple of weeks later, they bombed the camp in Zambia, right? Probably the biggest foreign invasion on Zambian soil, the ZAPU camp north of Lusaka. 400 people died. So was it perhaps part of like kind of an offensive strategy? Yeah, but very fascinating paper. I think this is really important work.
Brooks, do you want to answer these and we'll take the next round?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and I'm also realizing I didn't really address too much the issue of possible British involvement in the paper. Yeah, I mean, those are sorts of things that sure the actors, if they were involved, were trying to cover up. So it's quite hard to get to. Yeah, on the Zambian sources, yeah, I hadn't really thought to look much there. I know the UNEP archive has been digitized. I find it very difficult to work with online, but yeah, I think that's a good thought. In terms of the readership outside of Rhodesia, I mean, I haven't really gone around asking too many people from the time, well, do you remember the paper or not? But even some of the journalists who were active then, and I think I do quote Michael Holman, the FT correspondent who was based in Zambia. I mean, he had only a very vague memory of the existence of the paper, and that's by and large what I'm finding. So I don't think the presence outside of Zimbabwe was that extensive. I will also say, in terms of archival collections that I've looked at, don't really see clippings of the paper. So I mean that's something I'm really grappling with, and when this did go through its initial round of peer review, obviously the readers were too, in terms of the extent of its reach. Yeah, I also would want to reiterate in terms of the discussions about sort of covert engagement. I mean, what really stands out in reading the paper is that compared to just about any other published source from the era that I've looked at, it's really came off as much more even-handed, and you know it does really read as sort of a more or less a neutral, impartial paper. And I think, have I addressed everything? Yeah, I've lost my train of thought, so I'll wrap up there.
Do we have any more questions? Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and ask it. We have a question from Jogo in the chat that says, can you say more about, sorry, I'm trying to find it. Can you say more about the afterlives of newspaper founders? What did they do beyond the world? And then we have another comment from Nicole that says, in terms of the archives, in terms of the archives, I would look at, I also recommend looking into WikiLeaks archives on Tiny Roland. And the newspaper itself. He has a very interesting cable on Roland and the Genie that talks, and then she puts a link. Yeah. Any other questions?
Okay. Well, I can take. I think I just saw that one of the Zimbabwe Times staff members I spoke to, John Lonrho, I think I just saw that he is signed in. Yeah, but in terms of the afterlife, so as I mentioned, Munengatere, I mean, his that he's not featured more prominently in the historiography, that intrigues me. Freely admit I haven't been able to get the best sense of his career, but I mean, I think I don't really know when he passed away. I believe there was a Sunday newspaper that he started up in the late 80s or early 90s, which folded. But I think most of his post-Zimbabwe Times career he was I think Lonrho's chief spokesperson in Zimbabwe. When he came back, I did not mention that in addition to starting the newspaper, I don't know how he had time to do all this. He was also a lecturer at the University of Rhodesia. I forget in what department. I don't know if he continued to have a post at the University of Zimbabwe or not, but he was certainly a member of Harari's elite, and it's strange that he's not better remembered. The paper's deputy editor, Tendai Domachena, he continued working in journalism in Zimbabwe. I'm sorry, it's blanking. I think maybe he became a Rhodesia-based correspondent for the Rand Daily Mail after the Zimbabwe Times folded. Hopefully I have that correct. And then he, I think in the mid-90s, he settled in South Africa. Yeah, I mean, those are really the, I think and then John Lonrho, he was forced to flee Zimbabwe, I think around 1983, same time as Nkomo, when ZANU-PF cracked down on ZAPU. And I think those are really the three main figures who were most responsible for the newspaper's political coverage. There was also something I don't think I mentioned in Piers Brisbane paper. I mean, the Zimbabwe Times was I think its racial demographics were very interesting. It was quite an integrated production. I also corresponded via email with one of the white political sub-editors, who I think is now based in Britain, but also settled in South Africa and worked at one of the, is it the Mercury maybe? I think one of the newspapers in Durban. It was quite an integrated establishment, so there were several white reporters. I think Lonrho seconded some of its technical staff, secretaries and accountants, white employees. So that's, I think, something worth commenting on as well, the racial demographics. So yeah, that's the afterlives. And yeah, thanks Nicole for any sources. Yeah, I think there is some more stuff on Lonrho that I can read. I wonder how much of it would have much to say about the Zimbabwe Times, but yeah, if I could get a better sense of Lonrho's, whoever their directors were at the time in Rhodesia, I think that would be something that would be useful for the paper as well. Let me, if I'm missing anything on the chat, let me know.
We have one more comment in the chat that said, would Cephas Nsipa's autobiography be of any use in pursuit of freedom and justice? A memo was published by Rio Press in 2015. Yes,
I think I think I cite that in the draft of the paper. Unfortunately, not of a whole lot of use. I mean, he mentions his association with the newspaper. I think he was in some sort of financial straits that caused him to join, but I don't believe there's much more depth than that. I came on, I wrote this column. So in terms of the very fascinating question of what ZAPU may have been trying to do with the paper. And also, I mean, it's interesting that as one of the party's executive members, his role was not a secret. He was not anonymous, unlike Willie Musurura. So yeah, I mean, it's something that I think at least is putting the paper into the conversation, but it's the lack of depth is something I've noticed about the treatment in the secondary literature. I mean, unlike with the African Daily News, I'm forgetting the name, but the British gentleman who was the director of that paper at the time it was banned, he subsequently wrote a memoir of the experience. So I think certainly there's nothing in the secondary literature that sheds anywhere near that level of depth on the Zimbabwe Times.
We have a last round of questions. Is there any questions that someone wants to ask? Just our last round before we close up. Okay, if those are all the questions. Brooks, thank you so much for your presentation. I hope that it was enjoyable to go back and forth and have some engagement with it. Thank you for presenting your work. We really did enjoy it. And thank you to everyone for attending this history workshop seminar.
Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate the new directions to think about as I seek to tighten up the paper and hopefully get it published soon.
Thanks, Brooks. It was a great paper.
Thanks, Brooks. Well done.
We'll see everyone next week for the next history workshop seminar.